The lecture hall buzzed with anticipation, a restless energy that grew louder the moment the exam papers were passed out. Dozens of students leaned over their desks, pens ready, eyes bright with the confidence of preparation. Daniel Worthington, however, sat stiff and hollow, staring at the sheet of questions that blurred together like a foreign language. His tie, carefully knotted by a valet that morning, felt like a noose tightening around his throat. He tapped his pen against the paper but couldn't bring himself to write a single word. Around him, the scratching of pens sounded like thunder, each stroke reminding him of what he lacked. He lowered his eyes, praying no one would notice, though deep down he knew they all did. The professor walked by, shoes clicking with precise rhythm against the polished floor. He stopped briefly at Daniel's desk, eyes lingering with a mixture of pity and disappointment. No words were spoken, but the message was clear: you do not belong here. Daniel's ears burned as he forced himself to bend over his paper, pretending to think, scribbling meaningless shapes in the margins to hide the emptiness inside his head. When the hour ended, he gathered his paper with trembling hands, knowing the outcome before the ink dried. Students filed out, murmuring to one another. Their glances cut sharper than knives. He caught fragments as he passed them in the corridor, mockery thinly veiled as casual whispers. Worthington money can't buy brains. Daddy's billions won't help him now. A group of girls burst into giggles as he walked by, one of them covering her mouth and whispering loudly enough for him to hear. He's supposed to be the next heir? God help their company. Daniel clenched his fists but didn't respond. Silence was the only armor he had left. His footsteps echoed down the marble hallway, and though he held his chin high, his insides twisted with humiliation. By the time he reached the heavy oak doors that led outside, the weight of expectation pressed so heavily on his chest that he could barely breathe. The results came later that evening, pinned on the announcement board for all to see. Students crowded around, pointing, laughing, some even taking photos with their phones. Daniel pushed through the crowd, shoulders tight, and there it was in bold letters, his name at the very bottom. Failure again. Not just failure, complete collapse. He had become the punchline of the entire university, the billionaire's son who couldn't pass a single exam. By the time he returned home, the mansion's grand dining hall offered no comfort. Crystal chandeliers cast brilliant light across polished mahogany, but the brightness only seemed to expose his shame more cruelly. His father sat at the head of the long table, posture rigid, voice like a whip. Another failure? Richard Worthington's words echoed against the high ceilings, each syllable dripping with contempt. Do you have any idea what you're doing to this family's reputation? I built an empire with my bare hands, and you, my son, can't even pass a test? Daniel's mother sat quietly to the side, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. She said nothing, only glanced at Daniel with eyes that flickered with something between worry and resignation. The silence in that moment was heavier than his father's rage. I'm trying, Daniel managed to whisper, though his voice cracked. Trying? His father's fist slammed the table, rattling the silverware. You don't try, you succeed. Worthingtons do not fail. If you continue like this, you'll destroy everything I've built. The words stung more than any slap could have. Daniel lowered his eyes, the shame pooling inside him until it threatened to drown him. He pushed back his chair, muttered an excuse, and left the hall before the burn in his throat turned into tears. He couldn't let them see him break. The night air outside was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth after a recent rain. He walked aimlessly through the city streets, each step heavy, his thoughts a storm. Streetlights cast pools of golden light across the pavement, and somewhere far off a siren wailed. His reflection in shop windows stared back at him, a young man dressed in luxury, but hollowed out by failure. He hated the person he saw. Eventually, his path led him back to the university. The great stone building loomed against the night sky, windows glowing faintly. He slipped inside, footsteps echoing in the vast lobby. The place was quiet now, deserted except for the faint squeak of a mop against the marble floor. A figure moved in the shadows, pushing a bucket, humming softly to himself. Daniel barely noticed him at first. He leaned against the cold wall, sliding down until he sat on the floor with his head in his hands. The day's humiliation replayed in his mind, the laughter, the whispers, the disgust in his father's eyes. For the first time in years, he felt completely powerless, stripped of the illusion that his name could protect him. Across the hall, the janitor paused, watching the young man with calm, thoughtful eyes. His hands never stopped moving, the mop swishing steadily across the floor, but he tilted his head as though recognizing a story written in Daniel's posture. The quiet stretched, broken only by the rhythmic squeak of the mop, until Daniel finally looked up. Their eyes met briefly, one filled with despair, the other with something else entirely, something Daniel couldn't yet place. The janitor gave a small nod, then turned back to his work. He didn't speak, didn't pry, didn't offer the pity Daniel had come to expect. Instead, he simply continued, steady as ever, as though to say, some battles are fought in silence, and not all strength wears the clothes of power. Daniel pulled his knees close to his chest, the realization sinking deep into his bones. Rock bottom wasn't a single moment. It was a slow descent, and he had just reached the very floor. And yet, as the mop swished quietly in the distance, he had no idea that the man who cleaned those floors would soon change everything he thought he knew about failure, effort, and the meaning of success. The days that followed only tightened the noose around Daniel's pride. His failure had spread beyond the exam board. Whispered jokes turned into open mockery, and soon even strangers knew him not as the heir to a vast empire, but as the boy who couldn't answer the simplest of questions. When he walked across the courtyard, conversations dropped to hushed tones, followed by bursts of laughter once he had passed. His name had become entertainment, and every smirk chipped away at the fragile defenses he had left. In economics class, he tried to blend into the sea of students, keeping his eyes fixed on the notes he barely understood. The professor, a stern man with a sharp nose and colder tone, scanned the room before locking eyes with him. "Mr. Worthington," he said with deliberate precision, "perhaps you'd care to explain the principle of supply and demand to your classmates?" Daniel's chest tightened. He opened his mouth, but his mind went blank. The terms, though familiar, fluttered out of reach like leaves in the wind. He tried to force something out, anything, but only a broken stammer escaped. I don't know." The silence was crushing. For a second, the entire class sat in suspended disbelief. Then came the eruption, chuckles, snickers, even outright laughter. Phones tilted in his direction, recording every second. The professor sighed, shaking his head as though all his suspicions about the young Worthington were confirmed. By evening, clips were circulating online. "Billionaire's son doesn't know basics," one caption read. Another meme mocked his vacant stare, pairing it with cartoon speech bubbles that said, "What's a supply?" Students shared them with gleeful cruelty. Daniel's inbox filled with notifications he couldn't bear to open. Everywhere he went, people stared, not with respect, not with envy, but with amusement. When he returned home, his father was already waiting. Richard Worthington's jaw was tight, his voice clipped. "You've embarrassed this family enough. Do you have any idea how many investors called me today? They want to know if the future of this company is in the hands of a fool. And what answer do you think I could give them?" Daniel's throat was dry, his hands cold. "I didn't ask for the spotlight," he muttered, though even he heard the weakness in his voice. "You were born into it," his father roared, slamming his fist against the desk. "You are a Worthington. There is no room for weakness, no room for mistakes. If you cannot carry this name with pride, then perhaps you don't deserve it at all." The words tore into him. He wanted to fight back, to shout that he was more than just the weight of an empire he had never chosen, but the fire inside him had been smothered too long. Instead, he stood silently until his father turned away in disgust. His mother watched from the doorway, her face pale with worry but her lips sealed. Daniel knew she wanted to comfort him, but fear of his father's wrath bound her as tightly as any rope. That night, Daniel wandered aimlessly through the corridors of the university. The lights were dim, the halls mostly empty, but his humiliation clung to him like a second skin. He drifted into an unused lecture hall and sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. His mind replayed the laughter, the professor's sigh, his father's voice calling him a fool. He felt small, insignificant, like a ghost haunting his own life. The soft squeak of rubber wheels reached his ears. He looked up and saw the janitor, Mr. Harris, pushing his mop bucket into the room. The man hummed to himself as he worked, his movements steady, deliberate, without rush or hesitation. His gray uniform was faded, shoes worn, yet there was a calmness about him that filled the empty space. Daniel tried to ignore him, but Harris's presence seemed impossible to overlook. The janitor glanced at him once, then again, and finally spoke. His voice was low, but carried a weight that made Daniel look up. "You know, son," he said, pausing with his mop mid-swipe, "a test ain't about how much money your daddy's got. It's about how much fight you got inside." Daniel blinked, startled. He hadn't expected words, let alone wisdom, from the man most students never even acknowledged. His first instinct was to lash out, to protect his bruised pride. "You wouldn't understand," he snapped, his tone sharper than he intended. "You're just a janitor." The words hung heavy in the air, crueler than Daniel had meant them to be. But Harris didn't flinch. He leaned on his mop handle like it was a staff, his gaze steady and unshaken. "That's what they all see," he said calmly. "Just a janitor. But let me tell you something, cleaning floors teaches you more about life than sitting in 100 classrooms. Every stain's got a story. Every mess is a problem waiting to be solved. You either figure it out, or you let it bury you." Daniel frowned, uncertain whether to scoff or to listen. He wanted to dismiss the man, to tell him he didn't know what it was like to be crushed under the weight of expectation, but there was something in Harris's voice, something carved from years of struggle, that made him hesitate. "You don't know what it's like," Daniel muttered finally, his voice cracking. "Everyone expects me to be perfect, to live up to my father's name. And no matter what I do, I fail. Everyone laughs. Everyone thinks I'm a joke." Harris studied him, his expression unreadable. "Maybe the problem ain't them. Maybe it's that you've been trying to live up to a name, instead of living up to yourself." The words sank deep, heavier than any insult. Daniel looked away, but he couldn't shake them. For the first time, someone hadn't told him he was stupid, or worthless, or destined to fail. Instead, someone had told him the truth, that he was fighting the wrong battle. Harris returned to his mopping, leaving the silence thick with meaning. Daniel sat in his chair, staring at the worn floor, the echo of those words looping in his mind. As he finally rose to leave, he glanced back at the janitor. Harris didn't look at him again, but his steady movements, his quiet dignity, carried a weight Daniel couldn't ignore. He left the hall with a strange, unsettling feeling in his chest, like maybe, just maybe, he had heard something important. Something that could change everything. And though he didn't know it yet, those few words from a man with a mop would become the thread that began to pull him out of the pit he'd been sinking into all his life. Daniel's nights began to take on a strange rhythm. He would drift into the lecture halls after most students had gone home, books clutched under his arm though he barely knew how to use them. The silence of the empty rooms felt safer than the noise of the world outside, and in those quiet spaces, Harris was always there. The janitor moved steadily along the aisles, mops sliding across the floor in patient arcs, humming low tunes that seemed to calm the restless storm in Daniel's head. At first, Daniel came simply because he had nowhere else to go, but slowly, he found himself listening. Harris had a way of talking that stripped life of its layers of pretense. He spoke of small things, about growing up in a neighborhood where broken glass lined the sidewalks, where every paycheck meant the difference between hunger and survival. He told stories of long nights spent working 2 jobs, and mornings when he still found time to sit in the library and read book after book, because he refused to let ignorance chain him. "1 book a week," Harris said one evening, leaning on his mop as though it were a storyteller's staff. "Didn't matter how tired I was, how broke I was. Knowledge was the only thing no one could take away from me." Daniel had never heard someone speak of learning with such hunger. For him, knowledge had always been a requirement, a burden shoved at him by tutors who drilled formulas into his head while his father demanded results. He had never once thought of it as something to chase. Yet when Harris slid a battered paperback across the floor to him, its spine cracked, margins filled with tiny handwritten notes, Daniel felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: curiosity. He opened the book hesitantly, expecting boredom, but found himself tracing Harris's underlined words, reading the thoughts scribbled in the margins. They were simple, but they cut to the heart of the text in ways that startled him. He stayed long after midnight, flipping pages, not because he had to, but because he wanted to see where it led. Harris didn't push, didn't lecture. He only asked questions now and then. "What do you think this means? Why do you think the writer put it that way?" Every time Daniel answered, even clumsily, Harris nodded as though the attempt itself was worthy of respect. In class the next day, Daniel felt something new. The questions on the board still seemed daunting, but his mind didn't shut down in panic. Instead, fragments of last night's reading surfaced. He remembered Harris's voice saying, "Don't fight the problem. Understand it." He stared at one question for a long moment, then slowly worked through it. For the first time, he didn't leave the page blank. The following weeks turned into a cycle of failure and small victories. Daniel still struggled, still stumbled over concepts that others seemed to grasp effortlessly, but he was no longer alone in the fight. Every night, he returned to Harris, and every night, Harris offered him another book, another story, another lesson disguised as a conversation. Sometimes, Harris talked about patience, how cleaning one floor at a time built something grander than rushing in frustration. Other times, he spoke of discipline, of showing up even when the world had no applause to give. "Discipline beats privilege, son," he said once, locking eyes with Daniel. "You can be born with all the money in the world, but if you don't train your mind, it'll rot like a muscle never used." Those words echoed in Daniel's head long after he left the hall. He began to wake earlier, to read before breakfast. He started scribbling notes in the margins like Harris did. For the first time, he stayed behind after class not because he had been humiliated, but because he wanted to ask his professors questions. His classmates noticed the change. Some mocked him still, but others watched with quiet surprise as the boy they had written off as hopeless began to participate, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. When exam week returned, Daniel approached it differently. He no longer felt the crushing dread that had once paralyzed him. Instead, he treated each problem like Harris treated stains on the floor, patiently, step by step, without panic. "Figure out what caused it," Harris had said. "Break it down, solve it bit by bit." Daniel applied that same method to his exam. His pen moved slower than most, but it moved, and when the final bell rang, for the first time he walked out not hollow, but steady. The results were posted days later. Students crowded around the board as always, eager to see who had triumphed and who had failed. Daniel pushed his way through, bracing himself, though his heart thudded in his chest. His eyes scanned the list, and then, there it was. Daniel Worthington. Not at the bottom. Not in red. He had passed. Not just scraped by, but earned marks that were solid, respectable. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some students exchanged looks of disbelief. Others muttered that it had to be a mistake. But it was no mistake. Daniel had done it. He stood there in silence, the laughter he had once braced for replaced by stunned whispers. For the first time, he felt something different, a quiet pride that came not from his father's wealth, not from his family's name, but from his own effort. His hands trembled as he touched the paper, as though to prove it was real. Later that evening, he found Harris in the hall as always, pushing his mop. Daniel didn't say anything at first, only held up the results. Harris glanced at them, then at him, and smiled. "Told you. It ain't about who your daddy is. It's about what you're willing to put in yourself." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. "I didn't just pass. I actually understood it. For once in my life, I felt like I knew what I was doing." Harris chuckled softly. "That's the secret, son. Once you taste it, you'll never go back. Now the real work begins. Daniel nodded, determination blooming where despair had once lived. For the first time, he felt the stirrings of possibility. His classmates could whisper all they wanted, his father could judge him all he liked, but deep down, Daniel knew something had changed forever. And as the weeks turned into months, the world began to notice too. He was no longer the billionaire's son who failed every test. He was becoming something else entirely. Something of his own making. The months rolled forward, and the boy who once sat trembling over blank exam sheets began to shed his old skin. Daniel's name no longer clung to the bottom of the scoreboards like a stain. Slowly, carefully, it climbed higher. Not the very top, not yet, but consistently strong, consistent enough to make whispers of failure fade into murmurs of respect. Professors, once dismissive, now called on him without hesitation, and when he answered, his voice carried a steadiness no one had heard before. Even his classmates who had mocked him began to edge closer, curious about how the most ridiculed student on campus had begun to change. It wasn't just the grades. Daniel walked differently. His shoulders no longer sagged under the invisible weight of shame. He carried himself with the quiet resolve of someone who had learned to fight battles that couldn't be seen. The lessons Harris gave him, discipline, patience, humility, were no longer whispers in the dark. They had become part of him, guiding him through the chaos of expectations. And though no one else could see the janitor's fingerprints on Daniel's growth, Daniel knew every victory belonged just as much to Harris as it did to himself. At home, the shift did not go unnoticed. His father watched him one evening across the dinner table, suspicion flickering in his eyes as Daniel spoke calmly about a project he had been working on. The old Richard Worthington would have cut him down with sharp words, but even he couldn't ignore the difference in his son's demeanor. There was a focus there, a sense of direction that had never been present before. Still, Richard could not help himself. "What changed?" he demanded. "How did you finally stop wasting everyone's time?" Daniel hesitated. The instinct to shrink, to hide, still lingered, but he had grown too much to let it control him. "I stopped trying to be who you wanted me to be," he said softly. "I started learning for myself." His father's eyes narrowed, but before he could retort, Daniel added, "There's someone I want you to meet." Days later, Daniel led his father back through the echoing halls of the university. The elder Worthington's polished shoes clicked against the marble, his expression one of impatience, as though the very idea of being summoned here by his son was an insult. But Daniel pressed on until they entered an empty lecture hall. At the far end, as always, Harris worked in silence, mop gliding across the floor in patient strokes. Richard frowned, confused. "What is this?" Daniel's heart pounded, but he forced the words out. "This man taught me more than any tutor you ever paid for. He showed me discipline, how to fight through failure, how to keep going when the world laughs at you. Without him, I wouldn't be standing here the way I am now." The silence stretched. Richard's eyes flicked from his son to the janitor, disbelief etched across his face. "A janitor?" he said finally, the word heavy with doubt. Harris straightened, leaning on his mop, and gave a faint smile. "Not just a janitor, sir. A man who's learned a few things the hard way. Some lessons don't come with a price tag." For a long moment, the air in the hall felt thick, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then, to Daniel's astonishment, his father extended his hand. His voice was gruff, reluctant, but genuine. "Thank you," he said. Harris shook it firmly, then returned to his work without another word. He didn't seek praise, didn't bask in recognition. The shine of the floor beneath his mop was enough. Years passed, and Daniel's growth never slowed. He graduated with honors, each step across the stage carrying the weight of every failure he had once endured and overcome. Reporters snapped photos, investors clapped his father on the back, but Daniel's eyes scanned the crowd for only one figure. At the very back of the hall, in his worn uniform, Harris stood, watching quietly. When their eyes met, Harris gave a single nod, and Daniel understood. When he took the podium to deliver his commencement speech, Daniel's voice was steady, his words deliberate. He didn't speak of wealth, or a legacy, or the empire that awaited him. He spoke of the nights spent in silence, the lessons learned from failure, the power of persistence. And as he reached his final lines, he repeated the words that had saved him from despair. Knowledge is everywhere, if you're willing to learn. The hall erupted in applause, but Daniel barely heard it. He felt only the weight of those words settling into the lives of everyone listening, just as they had once settled into his own. He knew that some would forget, that some would dismiss it, but he also knew that somewhere in that crowd, one person would carry it forward, the way Harris had carried it to him. Later, as the sun set over the campus, Daniel walked through the halls one last time. The air smelled faintly of polish, and the soft squeak of a mop echoed down the corridor. Harris was there, as always, working quietly, the rhythm of his movements unbroken by time. Daniel approached him, diploma in hand. "I owe this to you," he said simply. Harris looked up, eyes crinkling with a smile. "You owe it to yourself, son. I just showed you the door. You're the one who walked through." Daniel swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. He wanted to say more, to pour out gratitude, but Harris had already turned back to his work, humming softly as though the world had not shifted around them. As Daniel stepped out into the night, the air cool against his skin, he carried with him the one truth that had reshaped his life, that legacies were not built on wealth or power, but on the quiet discipline of showing up, of learning, of enduring. And somewhere in the quiet of that university, a janitor with a mop smiled, knowing his secret had changed a life forever.